So, what happens when the world's highest court tells a country, sure, you can join this high stakes legal battle, but you can only watch the main event from the sidelines? Today, we're digging into a fascinating case of partial justice that literally redefined the rules of international law. I mean, just picture this. A country decides to jump into a major international dispute between its two neighbors. But then it's told it can listen in on one part of the conversation, but for the really important stuff, yeah, it has to stay out of the room. So was this some kind of partial victory, or was it just a clever legal move to keep them quiet? That's the big question, right? How did the International Court of Justice walk this legal tightrope to give such a confusing, split decision? To really get it, we've got to rewind and look at how this whole dispute got started. So let's talk about the original conflict that set the stage for all this drama. Because before a third country ever got involved, this was really just a classic border dispute between two neighbors. Okay, so this isn't just any old piece of paper. This is the official record from the International Court of Justice. And the title alone, a land, island, and maritime frontier dispute, tells you this was a huge deal. We're talking about who owns what on land, at sea, and even the fate of entire islands. For El Salvador and Honduras, the stakes just couldn't have been higher. So, these two countries basically came to the court with this giant, complicated puzzle. First, they needed a referee to finally draw the line where their land border was all fuzzy. Second, they needed a ruling on who actually owned the islands sitting in the Gulf of Fonseca. And third, they needed the court to figure out the legal status of the waters both in and around that same Gulf. And right here, this is where the plot really thickens. Because you see, the Gulf of Fonseca isn't some private lake between two countries. It's a shared body of water with three countries on its coast: El Salvador, Honduras, and, you guessed it, Nicaragua. So you just know that any decision about these waters was going to send ripples across all three nations. So when Nicaragua saw its neighbors about to get a final, binding ruling on a body of water it also shared, it decided it just could not afford to sit on the sidelines. It was time to intervene. And take a look at the timeline here. The original case had already been going on for more than 3 years before Nicaragua made its move. This wasn't some sudden decision. It was a really calculated legal strike. It brought the main case to a screeching halt and forced the court to deal with this new player in the game. So what even is intervention when we're talking about international law? Well, you can think of it like a legal +1 to a party. Under Article 62 of the court's rules, a country can ask to join a case if it thinks the final judgment could mess with its own legal interests. It's a way for a third party to protect itself. But, as we're about to find out, how you define affected is where the real fight began. Before the court could even get to the substance of Nicaragua's request, this whole procedural showdown just erupted. It was the first and, honestly, a critical hurdle that they had to clear. So who gets to decide on this intervention request? Is it the special 3-judge chamber that's already handling the main case? Or does it have to go to the entire 15-judge full court? This question alone sparked a little legal battle before the main event could even get started. And the two sides had totally different takes on this. El Salvador and Honduras were all about efficiency. They argued, hey, the chamber's already handling the case, it should handle all these incidental things too. But Nicaragua pushed back, hard, arguing for fairness. They said that letting a chamber that included judges picked by its opponents make the decision would just be fundamentally unfair. For Honduras, this was just a simple matter of procedure. You know, the chamber's in charge of the case, so the chamber should decide. It was all about keeping things neat and tidy. But Nicaragua's counter-argument was a really powerful one. They were basically saying, wait a minute, El Salvador and Honduras helped pick the judges for this chamber. Letting that same chamber decide if we can join? That's just not fair. It's kind of like letting your opponents pick the referee before you even step on the field. In the end, the court made its call, and it sided with procedure. It ruled that the specialized chamber did have the authority to decide on the intervention request. So round 1 went to El Salvador and Honduras. But the main event, that was still to come. All right, so with all that procedural dust settled, the chamber could finally give its verdict on the real question. Could Nicaragua intervene? And this is where we finally get the answer to that mystery we started with. The chamber's answer was basically, yes, but. Nicaragua was allowed to intervene, but only on one very specific issue, the legal status of the waters. See, one of the arguments was that the waters were a condominium, a kind of co-ownership between all three states. And the chamber agreed you can't really decide on a co-ownership without hearing from all the potential co-owners. So the door was cracked open for Nicaragua. But on every other issue, the door was slammed shut. Nicaragua was completely barred from making arguments about where the maritime boundary should be drawn, who owned the islands, or what the deal was with the ocean outside the Gulf. This was that partial justice we talked about, a win but with some major strings attached. And this is where you can really see the court's surgical precision. The chamber basically said that while Nicaragua obviously had a legal interest in the overall status of the Gulf's waters, it failed to prove how a specific boundary line drawn just between El Salvador and Honduras would affect its own legal rights. It's a really subtle difference, but it was a crucial one that decided the whole thing. Okay, so why are we even talking about this decades-old case today? Well, because its conclusion sent major ripples through international law. It clarified a fundamental concept that still shapes legal battles between nations to this day. What this case did was sharpen the definition of intervention. Its purpose is defensive. It's a tool that lets a third country protect its existing rights from getting damaged by a ruling between two other countries. It is not a free pass to jump into a lawsuit and start making your own new demands. And if there's one key takeaway from all of this, it's this simple but really powerful analogy. Intervention gives a country a shield to protect what it already has. It does not give it a sword to jump into the fight and try to claim something new. For that, you gotta file your own case. This case really leaves us with a huge fundamental question about international justice itself. How do you balance the sovereign rights of every nation involved with the practical need to deliver a focused and effective ruling? This judgment was a masterclass in walking that tightrope, but it also makes you wonder, in a world where all nations are interconnected, is partial justice sometimes the only real justice we can get?